Hey there. Hey everyone, I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for being here today. Got another great Theory of Change program for you today. This is, of course, an unfortunately event we're commemorating today, January 6th. And we're going to be talking about some of the larger context for that and how we got here, how it happened, and why it did. So, but before we get into that, I did want to remind everyone that Theory of Change is part of the Flux.community media network. And Flux is a new website featuring in-depth podcasts and articles about religion, politics, technology, and media, and how they all intersect. So please check that out. The website address is flux.community. And if you like what we are doing, please hit us up over on Patreon. We don't have any billionaires throwing money at us the way that these far right people do, and or even that these centrist Democrats do, getting their corporate media checks. So please do support the show. We put in a lot of work for you guys, and our guests are fantastic. So to help us keep bringing more of that to you and expanding and maybe doing it more days a week. So anyway, it's patreon.com/discoverflux. All right, well, so with that out of the way, let us get into today's program. It's now been a full year since a violent mob stormed the U.S. Capitol with the intent of overthrowing the 2020 election so that then President Donald Trump could illegally remain in office against the wishes of the American people. During the intervening 12 months, while hundreds of people have been indicted and convicted for their role in the events, almost nothing has emerged from the law enforcement investigations as to what Trump and his inner circle of aides were doing that tragic day. And that's because federal investigators can only reveal information connected to a formal criminal indictment. What is very clear, however, is that the tens of thousands of people who came to Washington that day were doing it for something much more important to them than the grievances of a snobby New York investor. For many, if not most of the people who entered the Capitol that day, invading the building was striking a blow for God against an America they despise. Unfortunately, this information was out there well before the Capitol invasion, but it wasn't reported much by the mainstream press, which spends most of its time obsessing over political gossip instead of actually understanding politics. Joining the program today to discuss all this with me is Bruce Wilson. He is a researcher and journalist who has studied Christian nationalist movements for decades and has tracked their ever-growing influence on Republican politics. Today, we're going to go through a number of specific moments to show that the attack on America was building for years and why the extremists who did it that day want to come back for more. So thanks for being here today, Bruce.
Sure.
All right. Well, so this is such a large story, and this is an insurrection in progress for decades, essentially. And because of that, there's a lot of context that is difficult for journalists, mainstream journalists whose primary job is to chase politicians around and take notes on what they say. So it's kind of hard for them to tell this full story. So, and even in a 1 hour podcast, roughly, it's hard for us to do that. So we're gonna tell the story through the lens of this guy who is a member of a radical anti-abortion movement group. And well, I guess let's talk about the group first a little bit, if you could. So Bruce, we're going to talk about Operation Save America, as they call it, which is part of a larger movement. Talk about that briefly, if you will, for a second, please.
Well, it's a number of decades old. It was originally founded by Randall Terry, later picked up by Flip Benham, and now it's got shared leadership. It was the more legitimate wing of what amounted to probably the biggest domestic terrorism phenomenon in the United States in the 20th century, which was the anti-abortion movement. There was nothing else like it, and the targets extended more than abortion doctors or abortion clinics. There was Eric Rudolph, who blew up a bunch of people at the World's Fair because he hated gays, the United Nations. There was a whole list. He was concerned about the New World Order, but anyway. So the ideology extends a lot further than you might think, and it underpinning it tends to be the Christian reconstructionist movement, which is where more than not the anti-abortion movement came out of. So there's a whole totalitarian, if you will, vision of how to radically restructure society that lays behind the anti-abortion movement. So ultimately, the Christian reconstructionists want to radically pare down government and to impose biblical law at the local level, a fairly severe reform. And this is
your audio just cut out there. Well,
let's see.
Okay, hold on. I guess while Bruce is working on that. There we go. Okay, you cut out.
Okay.
To drastically cut down government to the local level because they see that government has somehow intruded upon the rights of the church, and that the church should be in control of society, not the government.
Yeah, the Christian reconstructionists divide things into three separate spheres. There's the government sphere, the family sphere, which is the most immediate, and essentially the church sphere. And that's pretty much it. But so most justice would be administered through biblical law at the local level. Churches would have a big amount of input into that, and they often look to.
All right. Well, and so we're going to center the discussion around this guy who is a member of this movement. His name is Ante Pavkovich. He's a far-right pastor based out of North Carolina. And just to give people some context, I'm going to play so mostly what he does is he travels the country and screams at people and stalks them outside of abortion clinics. That's seems to be his primary occupation, if you will. So I'm going to play some footage of him denouncing people and denouncing America.
Most of the people today in America that go to church do not know God. Half of the churches in America are fake. The ministers are fake. They don't know God. It's a job to them. It's a vocation. It's a way to make money. They don't preach the true gospel. There's plenty of so-called pastors in America that tell their congregants that abortion is all right. Those are not men of God. Those are servants of the devil. So it doesn't matter how many people go to church in our nation. Most of our nation is lost. Look at it.
Yeah. And the clip goes on for ad infinitum, frankly. We don't need to play all of it. But basically, the core things to take away from it are that this is a far-right movement that sees America as ultimately, fundamentally illegitimate, that hates fellow Americans, that thinks that it's God's personal servants, and that anyone who criticizes them is Satan's little helper, if you will. This is it's a movement that blends racism, that blends misogyny, that blends religious fanaticism all into one. It's just this noxious cocktail. And there's something that's kind of interesting and unfortunate about a lot of people when they observe far-right politics is that they tend to think it's all just one thing, or it's all sexism, or it's all racism, or it's all religious fanaticism. But the reality is that it's all a different mix for different people. But the idea of a divine imprimatur kind of is perhaps the biggest motivator, but it certainly isn't the only one.
Yeah, another way you could look at it is that, broadly speaking, across the spectrum, from the Christian Reconstructionists to the charismatics, who I've spent an awful lot of time studying, they all think that America has fallen away from God and God's commandments, and there's a palingenetic thrust. They feel like the nation has become almost impossibly corrupt, and it needs to be restored to some imagined future glory, and palingenetic politics. It's what was going on in Nazi Germany. That they had a similar vision of national rebirth. So that underlies this, even as much as the anti-abortion people will talk about how awful America is. There still will be this vision in the background. It's always there in the Christian Reconstructionist vision that America has betrayed God's commandments, and therefore we are cursed. And but if we shape up and we prostrate ourselves before God and make amends, we will again receive God's blessing, and we will be great again. So, I can't hear you now, by the way.
Sorry. Yeah, make America great again, basically.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we'll see later on in the episode, that when Donald Trump, his campaign slogans and the things that he says are explicitly designed to parallel, in some cases, literally the exact words that these people say. And so basically, so that's the theology of these people and their political outlook. And they, in a lot of cases, are kind of sort of the engine behind a lot of other right-wing movements as well. So like the militia movement is heavily affiliated with Christian Reconstructionists and people like that have this idea of, someday we're going to overthrow the government because and return it to the way that God had made it in the Constitution. And the other thing also to note is that the January 6th, 2021 insurrection, it wasn't the only time that we've had violence at the Capitol or interruptions on the floor of Congress by people trying to stop official duties. And one of those that took place, it was an event that took place in 2007, and at the time it got almost no media coverage, and it was involving Ante Pavkovich, who decided that he and his Christian nationalist comrades decided, they were outraged that Harry Reid, who just recently passed away, who was the Senate Majority Leader at the time, Harry Reid had invited a man who was a Hindu religious leader to deliver the prayer in the Senate. So every day they have an opening prayer of their session. And most of the senators never attend it, but I guess it's a traditional formality that they've decided to just keep going. But nobody from a non-Christian religion for a long time, I guess they'd had Jews a couple of times, but no non-Christian or Jewish religious leader had ever done it up until this point in 2007. And so, well, actually, I take it back. There was another incident that happened in 2000. So that was the first time when they actually did have a Hindu person do a prayer, and there was a lot of anger on the Christian right against that. But nothing really happened as a result of it. But in 2007, there was a second moment where a Senate leader decided that they were going to invite in the name of religious pluralism, and the fact that this is an America for everyone, no matter what your faith or non-faith is, to deliver a prayer. And so there was a man that was invited whose name is Rajan Zed, and he's a Hindu religious leader based out of Nevada, and he decided to, so he got up on the dais at the Capitol, and he was interrupted. And C-SPAN 2 actually captured the footage of that day, but to my knowledge, it has never aired on any television network. So we're going to roll it in full here right now.
Today's opening prayer will be offered by a guest chaplain, Mr. Rajan Zed of the Indian Association of Northern Nevada.
Lord Jesus, forgive us, Father, for allowing the prayer of the wicked, which is an abomination in your sight, to be over.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the Senate.
We shall have no other gods before you. You are the one true and living God.
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the chamber.
Let us pray. We meditate on the transcendental glory of the Deity Supreme, who...
The Sergeant at Arms will restore order in the Senate, in the chamber.
Let us pray. We meditate on the transcendental glory of the Deity Supreme, who is inside the heart of the earth, inside the life of the sky, and inside the soul of the heaven. May he stimulate and illuminate our mind.
So, yeah, and he went on with a very nice, prayer where to try to get people to think, and respect each other. So there was certainly nothing objectionable to it, and normal people were not offended by it. But it was an important moment because at that time, so you heard two voices in the clip. Obviously the male voice was he was identified by the police as Auntie Pevkovich, but then also his wife Catherine Pevkovich was believed to be the woman who was in the clip as well. And they were carted off by the police and subsequently arrested for what they did and charged. But in the far-right Christian community, there was no condemnation for what they did. And there was no acknowledgement that it was a gross violation of all their rhetoric of pretending to be concerned about religious freedom and religious liberty. That's something that you've looked at also, that these movements often try to use the term religious freedom as kind of a cudgel to bash everyone else, but they themselves don't actually believe in it, right?
Yeah, they're ultimately supremacist. I mean, no other religion other than their particular form of Christianity, which in this case would be typically Protestant, which Christian reconstructionism is, and this viewpoint extends over to the charismatic side of the equation, is so that even fellow Protestant denominations, Methodists and Episcopalians and Presbyterians and so on, certainly Unitarians, are seen as illegitimate and perhaps under sway of demons. So that's how extreme it is. And even though the Christian reconstructionists don't do this, but among the charismatics, say the new apostolic people, they will show up on stage quite happily with Catholics. But when they're in private, they will make no bones about the fact that the Catholic Church is at least under the sway of demon influence. So that's how extreme it is. So it's no surprise that these Operation Save America people were screaming about a Hindu prayer, which they saw as the worst form of sacrilege that was probably at some point going to bring down God's wrath. That's the way it works.
Yeah, and like they've some of them have explicitly talked about how that, you know, who was it? I think Rushdoony actually talked. R.J. Rushdoony, who was the founder of Christian Reconstructionism, actually wrote about how religious freedom was something that they would use, but didn't believe in. Is that? Do you remember that specific phrasing of his? Otherwise, we can move on if you don't.
Yeah, I vaguely remember it, but it was also echoed by his sometime second in command, Gary North. There was a break at some point, but North essentially said the same thing. He said, "We will use democracy to get rid of it." That's a paraphrase, but so
yeah. Well, and that's the thing, like, you know, and it's something that they have in common with, you know, other far right movements, whether it's ones that tend to be more misogynist oriented, like the Proud Boys, or ones that tend to be more racially motivated, is that they see the vast majority of Americans as not the real Americans, and that only they and their political allies are Americans, that no one else actually deserves rights or freedom in their thinking. Is that accurate, would you say?
yeah, and I've been really surprised since the advent of Trump that the Republican Party has they've walked right up to overtly acknowledging that they want to be a Herrenvolk democracy. They want a Herrenvolk democracy, which is an ethnic democracy, or for them, that would be a white ethnic democracy, a democracy of the minority, and that they would, of course, find ways of excluding all other ethnicities from the vote.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and now I'm going to play a clip from a guy named John MacArthur. He's a mega church pastor here in California, extremely influential within far right Christianity. But most people have never heard of this guy. But he is, you know, rolling in money, and actually was behind the lawsuit that when he wanted to keep his church open in the pandemic, that the Supreme Court ruled in. So this is him talking about what he really thinks about religious freedom.
I read the other day that one of the evangelical publicists, whatever that is, said he's happy to let us know that the new administration will uphold religious freedom. Really? The new administration will uphold religious freedom? I don't even support religious freedom. Religious freedom is what sends people to hell. To say I support religious freedom is to say I support idolatry. It's to say I support lies. I support hell. I support the kingdom of darkness. You can't say that. No Christian with half a brain would say, we support religious freedom. We support the truth. If the new administration supports religious freedom, get ready. Persecution will be ramped up, because the more supportive they are of the devil's lies, the less they're going to tolerate the truth of Scripture. We're not going to lobby for freedom of religion. What kind of nonsense is that? We are in the world to expose all those lies as lies.
Yeah, and he goes on, and look, that is the mentality that America is only for them, and that, you know, they've had the increasing realization since Republicans have not won the popular vote in the presidential election since 2004, that, you know, the hold that they think they deserve, that they're entitled to on America, it's slipping, and they're getting upset about it. Um, yeah, I mean, it's really disturbing. And so that's kind of the background, the context here. So we have the theology, which says that the far right are the only ones entitled to governance. Then we have the idea that they can just go ahead and disrupt anything that they want because they're the servants of God. And I think one example where it was something that at the time it did receive a lot of coverage, but people didn't, I don't think they paid attention fully to it. And that is Kim Davis, the Kentucky county clerk, who in 2015 refused to perform marriages after the Supreme Court in Obergefell versus Hodges had said that same-sex marriage needed to be legal. And so people, were generally aware, who followed the news, that she was doing this, but they didn't understand why, I think. And a lot of that was because of the news media. They didn't cover it much. So I'm going to just briefly play a clip of her talking to people when she was refusing to do the marriages, and then maybe you can talk about that context a little bit.
Why are you not issuing marriage licenses today?
Because I'm not.
Under
Why?
whose authority are you not issuing licenses?
Authority.
Your lawyers tell you. I don't
Did
believe
God
in your
tell
God.
you to do this? Did God
I
tell
don't
you
believe
to
in your
treat
God.
us?
I don't
like
believe in your
this?
I've
God.
asked you all to leave. You are interrupting my
You can call the police if you want us to leave. You can call the police.
Yeah. So that's just a little short moment. But there's a lot of doctrine behind there that I think a lot of people haven't heard of. Tell us a little bit about that, Bruce, if you could.
Well, it emerged out of the most extremely racist, white supremacist wing of the militia movement. And the doctrine was the doctrine of the lower magistrate, that if a lower authority were asked to do something which ran contrary to God's law, or a perceived interpretation of the Constitution also, because there's a lot of legalistic mumbo jumbo attached to this, basically crackpot interpretations of the Constitution. But should this happen, the lower magistrate, and they walk this back to English common law. The idea is that some officials, especially county sheriffs, who are almost sacred in this viewpoint, they can simply flip off state or federal government, and this will be okay. But this ideology has been gaining ground to the point where we're on the cusp of having county sheriffs openly deputize militias. There was this character, Dara Leaf in Michigan, who was friends with a couple of the characters who had been charged with plotting to kidnap Governor Gretchen Whitmer. And that's not the only example. There are a lot of examples of county sheriffs across the country. It's far from a majority tendency. It's still very much a minority, but still, there are lots of examples of county sheriffs who have become quite close to local militias. So, it's yeah.
So, but the doctrine, though, the lesser magistrate. So, they believe that they can, that any lower official, no matter how low level, like a county clerk, if they believe that a higher official has acted in violation of God's law, that they can just overturn it, right?
Yeah.
So what is the idea behind that? Like, where do they get that idea?
Well, ultimately, God's law supersedes man's law. That's the short of it. The ultimate authority is God, and if you're really sticking to your guns, if you're really true to your beliefs, you will stand by that. Now,
yeah, of course. But now, how do they resolve, or do they even consider the problem of, well, what if you've got two people who say they're acting in God's name but have different ideas?
Well, I think the idea is that we'll take power first, and then we'll work out those details later. I mean, the religious right is a vastly complex coalition, and should they achieve complete control, the resulting infighting will be quite extreme. Catholics, Protestants, Mormons, Jews, Hindus, on and on and on. There will be lots of religious persecution, lots of internecine religious infighting, and so it'll be, in short, a mess.
Yeah, well, and they basically they've resolved, first we have to destroy pluralism and secularism, and then after that we can sort everything out subsequently. And it's a thing that, the problem with pluralism is that it's something that almost everyone believes in, but most people don't understand why it's good and what the point of it is. So, why, for instance, so like in America's founding, the founding, the creators of the Constitution deliberately decided to keep religion out of it because they saw that it would be harmful to both religion and the people who were minorities, but they saw that it would be harmful to the majority as well. And so, but basically, you could argue that this idea of, America as a nation only for Christians, that's the original big lie, in a sense, right?
Yeah, they kept that space open, but there were other pernicious things going on, like allowing for slavery, which eventually generated a whole new theological tradition in the South, which eventually got kind of codified by theologians like Robert Louis Dabney, which in turn actually became the precedent for Christian reconstructionism, which in its most extreme form is wildly racist and validates some form of slavery.
Well, and that was the point of it, originally. Well, and the other thing about the Kim Davis episode that I think is important in retrospect is that, so you had a government official deliberately refusing to perform official duties, and it was something that it built on what happened in 2007 with Rajan Zed, that at first that was only just 3 people screaming in the well of the Senate, but now with Kim Davis, you had after she was held in contempt of court, she held a rally outside of her jail after she refused to even comply in any way with judicial orders. And Mike Huckabee, who was a presidential candidate, Republican presidential candidate, was there, and he built the stage. They literally built a stage for this woman, and were treating her as a hero. And I've got a clip here of Rick Santorum, who was another Republican presidential candidate, who hailed her, and he did it on CNN.
Obligation of, I believe, of a president of a Congress when the court acts unconstitutionally, and I believe they have acted unconstitutionally, is to use the power that is inherent in the Constitution that we call checks and balances. When a president acts unconstitutionally, the court can slap down the president. What happens if the Supreme Court acts unconstitutionally? Who gets the opportunity to challenge them?
Do you think it's Kim Davis? Do you think it's a county clerk in Rowan County, Kentucky?
I would agree that what Kim Davis did, in my opinion, was heroic, and she suffered the consequences from it. She was obviously, I think the putting her in jail was ridiculous as an extreme position. But you know what? That's sometimes what it takes for people who stand up and conduct civil disobedience because the law is unjust to suffer the consequences of that. And so I commend her for actually standing up for her principles.
Yeah. So, I mean, you could argue, I think, that in some sense, what Kim Davis was doing, was it that different than what Donald Trump wanted on January 6th, the Congress to do? I don't think it was.
I mean, if Kim Davis's argument had any legal or constitutional merit, regardless of what Rick Santorum says, she could have filed a lawsuit and it would have plotted its way up to the Supreme Court. eventually if it had some merit.
Well, actually, yeah, but she did appeal actually, and they denied her.
Yeah. So.
So that was it. So yeah, she lost through the court system, and she refused to comply with lawful orders. And so, but this was, as I said, the in the first insurrection, if you will, with Pavkovich and his family interrupting the Senate, people didn't pay attention to it. And even on the religious right, only the most extreme people dared to say anything about it favorable. There were some people and organizations, this far right group called the American Family Association, which actually owns over 100 radio stations across America, pumping out Christian nationalist, supremacist stuff. They were in favor of them, and there was there were these other, a couple of other organizations that said something. But here with Kim Davis, you had, she was being hailed at the national level by presidential candidates for defying the law and for overturning. And it's important to remember also that the court, when they made that decision, the majority of Americans supported same-sex marriage. So. Mm-hmm. This was something that everybody, for the most part, was in favor of. But interestingly enough, one person who showed up for Kim Davis afterward, according to the Associated Press and several other publications that were out there, was Ante Pavkovich. So he showed up there at a rally. He stood in the lobby, actually, of the office. So after Davis was released from jail, she decided that she would have her deputies issue marriage licenses, but not have her name on them. And so Pavkovich, he showed up saying that the deputy clerks should be fired. And then he said the following, and definitely this is not family-friendly language, so I'm just going to read it here. But yeah, I wouldn't recommend kids listening to it. So he said, "Thinking of what the sodomites have done should make you sick," he told the deputy clerks. And so he's kind of this, Ante Pavkovich is kind of like the Forrest Gump of insurrection. Keeps turning up at all these things, and so does this Operation Save America. But he's not the only person involved with this organization. So it was started by this guy named Randall Terry. Tell us a little bit about Randall Terry.
I'm going to have to ask him that because he's not my specialty.
Oh, okay, all right.
Yeah.
Well, did you pay attention to the guy who took over after him, Flip Benham?
Yeah.
Just briefly, who is he?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't specifically.
Okay.
Watched him.
Well, okay. Well, something about Flip Benham also, though, is that so a lot of people, because there isn't enough reporting about radical Christian supremacism in the media. People who have these viewpoints sometimes are able to worm their ways into more mainstream affairs. And Benham actually has two sons who were given a show on, what was it, HGTV, I believe it was, right? It was a real estate property show, and it was starring his two sons who have all the same views as their extremist father. And nobody involved with the TV network seems to have done anything to investigate that at all. And after it came out, people started looking at, well, who are these people? What are they doing? And they found out, wow, they're affiliated with radical anti-abortion groups and have all these strange viewpoints and extreme ideas. But I guess now, in addition to that, though, we have the Kim Davis thing as sort of a focal point. But these ideas of kind of overturning America or delegitimizing it also. Sarah Palin was also involved in that as well. and was instrumental in bringing that into the Republican Party mainstream as well. That's something you've also talked about and written about.
Yeah, that's kind of more my bailiwick. If you can walk it back farther than Sarah Palin, I mean, the 2000 election was shut down by an acolyte of the New Apostolic Reformation, and that had the effect on our politics is almost hard to overstate. So Palin was far from the only.
Yeah. Well, what is the New Apostolic Reformation for people who don't know what that is?
It's basically something that's emerging out of a hyper-charismatic movement that's global called the Third Wave, which purports to do miracles, holistic raise the dead, everything that Jesus was said to have done. It claims that eventually its followers can learn to do that. So it's very, very seductive. It's sort of aligned with the prosperity gospel movement, but not exactly the same. And it's organizing out of this third wave movement, which was about 300 million strong by 2000, and at least twice as big now. So it's kind of a big deal, and it's essentially it's becoming organized as a new religion. But Palin grew up in essentially the heart of this New Apostolic Reformation's effort to move into Alaska. Her church was they called her church the Beachhead. So she was groomed by one of the movement's apostles and prophets, and grew up as a young woman trying to pray witches to death, and was subjected to all of the movement's various propaganda. But and I can guarantee that these people were out in considerable force on January 6th. I've tracked some of them. One of them, I can't positively say, but one of them seems to have been Larry Brock, who was a guy who was seen in intact gear with a helmet and holding zip ties on the floor of the house, apparently looking for people to zip tie. And a major newspaper discovered a Facebook photo of Brock and his wife and two children in front of Dallas's Gateway Church, which is one of the biggest mega churches in the country right now. But the Gateway Church was where the New Apostolic Reformation was really launched in 1999. They put together essentially a dues-paying organization of their so-called apostles, who they pretty much deem who is an apostle. But anyway, this is a real organization that's still around, and they've got now a U.S. component. They've got an international component. They've got apostles organizations in maybe a third of the countries on the planet, a lot of places, and nobody even knows this movement exists, but they were very much there on January 6th, along with the Christian Reconstructionists.
Well, yeah, and the NAR, their organizing strategy is important also because they target and they try to work inside of other people's congregations to kind of take them over from within. And a lot of these pastors have no idea that this is going on, and in some cases may even be helping them, and don't realize it. It's pretty terrible if you're trying to keep your church from being subverted from within. And so there were all these different constituencies who were there on January 6th, but the New Apostolic Reformation and the Christian Reconstructionists, they're also linked to the prosperity gospel as well. So that guy John McDonald, who I played earlier, is he's all heavily into prosperity theology, telling people, if you give me money, then God will give you money. and things like that. And they were also really the first people on the Christian right to start supporting Donald Trump also.
Yeah, the charismatics, especially the New Apostolic people, back in 2015, I started to notice that, there's a guy named Lance Wallnau. He's an apostle. He's an apostle in the U.S. Coalition of Apostolic Leaders, a dues-paying organization, which has regular meetings, yearly meetings at least.
He wrote a book. He called it the Trump Prophecies, I believe.
Yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. Back when I met him, I identified him as being in the New Apostolic movement. He told me, "How do you know that?" And I said, "Well, people write articles. Your name pops up." And he said, "Did I ever read a book?" I said, "No." He said, "Yeah, that's why. So you can't pin me down." Essentially. But then after the advent of Sarah Palin, he dropped that and started writing books, and he's been in a lot of books, like essentially Seven Mountains, Capture the Seven Mountains books, that sort of thing. But anyway, he was maybe one of the earliest people to jump on Trump as a King Cyrus figure, which is one of the ways.
Who was King Cyrus, if you don't know?
King Cyrus was a Persian king who essentially released the Jews from captivity. He didn't believe in the Jewish faith in any way, but he did that, and so he's
a character in the Esther story, then.
And he's seen as a righteous figure, not a believer, but a righteous figure who ultimately is somehow being influenced by God to do the right thing. So by making Trump a Cyrus figure, they allowed for all his personal faults, while suggesting, he's kind of wretched personally, but he will do the right thing. And for the movement, he did. Those Supreme Court justices are an amazing contribution to the movement, and there's so much else we don't know and may never know about how he influenced federal government. So really, it was a good bargain for them to overlook his wretched personal life.
Yeah.
So
and then I guess one of the other things. So basically, they were kind of these, and so they're like even further to the right than your average typical conservative Christian. Like, these are genuine reactionaries. I think it's fair to use that label. And after Trump lost the 2020 election, and was looking around for any possible way to stay in office despite losing, so he filed all these court cases. Lost every one of them except for one, which he kind of halfway won on a procedural way, but otherwise lost scores of lawsuits. But after that, by the end of December, after all the legal options had collapsed, or as they were collapsing, they started going for their sort of plan B, which was an intimidation campaign on the Congress. Because people forget that for the longest time there were no members of the Senate who actually were going to challenge the votes on January 6th. They were refusing to do it. But so Trump and his minions had really started to try to drum up anything possible to really fire people up, and so they went naturally for the people who supported them the hardest at first, and that was the reactionary Christian right. And they came up with this campaign, Save America, which isn't that interesting when you think about it, because of course that is the name of the organization that we've been talking about here, of Ante Pavkovich, Operation Save America. Of course, now when they say Save America, who do they want to save it from? That was a question I never heard anybody in the mainstream media ask these people. Why are you calling it Save America? And what is the larger context for it? But that was a very real and direct attempt to pilfer the actual slogans of these far right groups, and Donald Trump himself literally. So he went around as he was complaining about losing on a cross country tour. He put it on his podium, "Save America." They actually released this picture of him pointing upward at the sky, and with a light shining on his face and saying "Save America" behind him as well. So a very deliberate adoption of their imagery. Pretty, and it was something that I didn't see, a lot of mainstream media people at the time in the days and weeks leading up to 1/6. They didn't talk about this stuff.
Well, at a later stage, there came the rallying for the actual coup, which I interpreted as the Jericho March events, and there were a number of those, and there was the one on 12/12, which was pretty big, and you had a number of people who were directly associated with the apparent coup attempt up on stage with, predominantly the biggest block at that one. It was called, of course, ecumenical. There were Catholics and there are any Hindus, but the biggest Christian block were the New Apostolics. But since nobody really covers them, that was not identified. But anyway, that's when the language turned really militant, and they were talking about the Black Robe Brigade, and the very concept of the Jericho March. We're gonna march around Jericho. The walls will fall down, and as Joshua's army did, slaughter everyone inside. Every Christians know this story. It was very deliberately picked. So
yeah, well, and also, they were going even further than just telling the story or taking the label. They were taking the traditional Jewish trumpet, the shofar, and blowing it at their ceremonies.
Well, that's a new apostolic thing, by the way. That's coming out of the Messianic Jewish wing of the movement, and it is they tend to pull out the shofars, bring in the Messianics and pull out the shofars at big events. There was one stadium event back in 2007, fronted by Lou Engle, where they had 200 people blowing 200 shofars marching into like a baseball stadium, and Senator Sam Brownback was there. He knew Engle; they've been roommates. But anyways, the shofars there's a context for them. It's about the appropriation of Jewish identity. It's done because this so-called Messianic Judaism, it's meant to sort of woo and also supplant Judaism. So that's why, and the shofars also carry this very aggressive symbolic meaning of that we're gonna conquer and slaughter. Pull out a shofar, and people know the story.
Yeah, and let me just see if I can pull up a picture of a shofar for people who haven't seen that. It looks like it's saved it in the wrong spot. Okay, well, those of you watching, I guess you guys can do an image search. It's SHOFAR, if you're wondering how to spell that. And so, yeah, it basically. So the idea also, though, so in the Joshua and Jericho story, they were doing the shofars in the days leading up to the big battle of Jericho. And so it was preparation for the battle that they were going to enter into the city and take it over.
Yeah, they marched around Jericho for 7 days, presumably blowing the shofars. On the seventh day, they blew the shofars again, and the walls came down. Interestingly, the New Apostolics, they had a number of permits around the Capitol, and they had a thin perimeter of their people with shofars. They commenced blowing those shofars at just about the same time as the onslaught on the Capitol commenced. I'm not saying that it was an army of new apostolics. It was quite a mix of different people from the Operation Save America types, the anti-abortion Christian reconstructionists. There were new apostolics. There were lots of much more secular anti-government types of various stripes, but they were the ones who were sacralizing the attack with those shofars.
Yeah, so, exactly. They turned it into a religious ceremony, essentially.
Yeah.
With what they were doing, and there are many days of praying up on stage, and so January 5th, in a lot of ways, was when you saw the motivations of the people who were actually there. Like that sometimes they actually would take people out of the crowd and put them up on the stage at some of these events. And so, whereas the Trump January 6th rally, he was tightly controlled to be limited to people in his inner circle and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But even there, you had the violent language where Trump said that people have to fight like hell, or you won't have a country anymore. And then you had people like the Mo Brooks, the Alabama Republican congressman, who talked about how today we're going to go to the Capitol and start. Well, he didn't say to the Capitol. We're gonna start kicking asses and taking names. And so, there was when you add that type of rhetoric to these days and days of telling people, this is your moment to be a Bible character. Mm-hmm. You can be part of the Bible. That's what this is basically, and it's. I think for a lot of people who, let's say, don't believe in the Bible let's say they do believe in the Bible, but they don't believe those stories are real. There's a temptation to think, oh, that's just stupid. These people are dumb, but they're more than dumb. They're very determined and extreme. And if you just dismiss them as that, then you're being naive.
To return to the Joshua Jericho tale, part of that tale is that before the attack, Joshua sends a couple of spies into Jericho, and they're put up by a prostitute, Rahab, who was the only person who was spared after the sack of Jericho. Well, so in the January 6th attack, what happens is the shofars blow, the swarms of people from various factions start to attack, and at the same time, Michelle Bachmann, who very much has taken me a while, but I've identified her as part of the New Apostolic Reformation. She saunters up to a door of the Capitol, knocks. She's got her ID. She has the credentials to go in. And she identifies herself. They let her in, lock the door again. And she walks up, she makes her way to Kevin McCarthy and has some sort of powwow with Kevin McCarthy. This is by her own description, by the way. I've got the audio of her talking about it. And she talked about on a podcast of another New Apostolic character. But so she talks to Kevin McCarthy, and then she makes her way to a room in the Capitol that's some sort of prayer room. It's called like George Washington's prayer room or something like that. And but it just happens to be almost adjacent to Nancy Pelosi's office, and by her own account, she stands there watching people flee Nancy Pelosi's office. So think about this in the context of the Joshua Jericho narrative. Well, they've got a handy spy on hand. And then eventually she makes her way to a late afternoon appointment with the Secretary of State. So yeah, make of it what you will.
Yeah. Well, and there's other, there have been some allegations that Lauren Boebert, who also is a far-right evangelical, had been allegedly been giving tours to some of the people who went into the building as well. beforehand, and some other individuals were accused of that as well. But at this point, according to the committee, they haven't seen any evidence that substantiated that allegation yet. I think we should point that out. Just to continue the story, though, so with Ante Pavkovich, he also was there again at another insurrection. So he was there, and on their website, so he has a group, as I said, called Operation Save America. So they filed a report from Washington, D.C., and obviously you can't see it on the screen here, so I'll zoom in a second, but they acknowledged that they were there, and they said Ante Pavkovich, Frank Campana, and Assistant Director of OSA, that's Operation Save America, Jason Storms, set up the Lord's beachhead at this immense gathering. And so they were there by their own admission. And there are some other details about what they did there and what Operation Save America did, and that are also worth noting. And so the website Prism worked with a couple of organizations to track some footage that came out of there, out of that day. And they talked about specifically how anti-abortion activists were there. And Jason Storms, who I mentioned is the assistant director, he videotaped himself standing on the scaffolding outside the Capitol and calling it a revolution. So he was there to cheer it on. He wasn't there he was there to participate. He was not just there to minister to the wayward protesters. And then further on in the piece, they talk about other anti-abortion people who were there. John Brockhoft, who's convicted abortion clinic bomber, set off a bomb in 1985 in Cincinnati, Ohio, and then was convicted of planning to do another bomb in Pensacola, Florida. So these are, and then there were other people there that you had noticed as well. And I guess we can maybe talk about that in a second. But one of the other things that was in that Prism article was that, so these Operation Save America people, they were also there when the woman who got shot by the Capitol Police as she was trying to enter the Capitol, secure a room, Ashley Babbitt, they were there as well. And these supposedly pro-life individuals just sat there filming her as she bled to death. And nobody bothered to try to administer to her wounds or anything like that. They just sat there and watched her die. These are people who say that they care about life. So it's an interesting illustration of what they actually seem to think.
Oh, yeah. Well, among the new apostolic leaders, what was interesting to me was somebody like Lance Wallnau, who was there too. He marched over after Trump's speech. He went on a podcast the day after and said, media is painting it as if we were some sort of rampaging army. That's not what I saw. I saw the intercessors. They were getting tear gassed, but the people who were really behind the violence were Antifa. And he had a whole bunch of obviously pre-memorized details to regurgitate about that. And he was not the only one. That was the line coming out of a lot of New Apostolic leadership, not all, but one specific faction right after January 6th. There was a big push to try to blame Antifa, even though the evidence wasn't there. And meanwhile, there was absolutely no recognition of the fact that the mob was viciously beating Capitol Police with clubs and flags, and they were using bear mace too, all sorts of fun items of assault. So there was absolutely zero recognition of the violence that went on. There was an attempt to totally invert reality because, well, it was clear to me that there would have been a hope that Antifa would actually show up and be a pretext. And nobody from the left did show up, so they were left hanging with this narrative that they were supposed to push. And it's not fitting that well a year later.
Yeah. Well, and one of the people that I mentioned, Jason Storms, you sent me before the show. So he's another Operation Save America guy, but he is also married to the daughter of a Christian reconstructionist named Matthew Trewhella. You want to talk about him a little bit?
I mean, he's been convicted of various forms of anti-abortion clinic violence, but he's also very much a Christian reconstructionist. He believes that even people seeking abortions should be executed, so he's fairly far out. But
yeah. Well, and it's important to note that this is the theology that we're talking about here, that when you believe that you are God's servant, your opponents are Satan's servants, they are murderers who themselves deserve to be killed, and also you have the right to disobey any law that you want. That's a recipe for insurrection, pretty much. And so that's kind of what we saw. And this is a movement that they in the hours and days afterward, they were proud of what they did, to a large degree. So some of the more media savvy ones started realizing, oh, this is a bad look for us. But the shock troops, the cannon fodder, they were happy with what they did, and they want to do it again. I think that's fair to say.
Yeah, I mean, in some version, the way I look at it, and parenthetically, Jason Storm, one of his operations, he runs I guess you'd call it a ministry for rehabilitating veterans with PTSD. So this is not the only operation like that in the Christian right. There are a number of them. It's a way of inducting ex-military people into their viewpoint. But
yeah, no, exactly. And they and when we look at the some of the other activities that they've done, so even before, and I should have mentioned this earlier, you had one of the other precursor events to January 6th was took place in 2020 in Michigan. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it for a second there, but so much happened, in those few months that people kind of forget about it. It's easy to forget, and so I'm just gonna, so in Michigan they had a protest in which they had people from, different militia movements come into their capital with all kinds of weapons, body armor, and then they started pounding on the doors and demanding to be let in. And Trump, he responded, "These are very good people, but they are angry. They want their lives back again. See them, talk to them, make a deal." Now, that's pretty much, again, that was what he essentially tried to do on January 6th.
Yeah.
They had people invade the Capitol, pound on the door, demanding something, and Trump wanted them to get what they wanted.
Yeah. One thing I want to add about the Michigan thing is that since 2009, there was established across from the State Building in Lansing a so-called House of Prayer. This is where charismatics, usually kids, in their teens or 20s, will basically live and pray nonstop, and be hanging out in front of the Capitol praying a lot too. And this is part of a charismatic initiative called Transformation Michigan, which has been running since 2009. And there's a relationship between that and the militia movement. I can guarantee not all the people in the militia movement are of that particular brand of Christianity. Some of them will be, but there's this it has the function of once again sacralizing opposition to government, and they're right across the street. But
yeah, they and then they subsequently, the militia movement and other people were, contemplating the idea of kidnapping Governor Gretchen Whitmer as well. So, this is sort of the context that all these things are taking place in. And it's important for people who do know the truth about these movements and how much power they have within so-called mainstream Republican Party politics. You need to spread the word about it. Tell people about what you know. When you see a good article or a good podcast or something like that, share it on your social networks or with your friends or your family to let them know. Because as somebody who myself used to be involved in Republican politics, I had no idea how horrible these people were and who I was helping. So there are some people out there who can be educated and learn about what's going on. So it's worth the effort, even if you can't convince a lot of these reactionary fundamentalists to mend their ways. At least you have a much greater chance of helping people not enable them, I would say.
yeah, well, actually, in my experience, the people who sometimes get the most are former moderate Republicans. One year I worked part of the year for Mikey Weinstein, who runs the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. He flew me down to Stone Mountain, Georgia, where I recorded a B-1 bomber pilot saying that, yes, there would come a day where I'm going to have to buck the command chain and work for Jesus. I have no idea what happened to that with that. But anyway, yeah, the people, and Mikey Weinstein was a former lawyer for Ross Perot. And he was a moderate Republican until he found out what was going on at the Air Force Academy, because his kids were going there and they were Jewish and they were getting beaten up. So, and there were predatory evangelism efforts going on against them too. But anyway.
Yeah. Well, no, it's important to spread this knowledge. And so I do really appreciate you coming on the show today, Bruce.
Sure.
I always love talking to you, tapping your brain with all the stuff about all this. So for those of you who are on Twitter, Bruce is on Twitter. He's Bruce Wilson on Twitter. I guess that's the best way to find you. You're publishing some freelance stuff here and there. So
not for a while, but I may be getting back into it.
Yeah, I hope you do, and you can publish something for us at Flux as well.
Okay.
One of these days. I'd love that. But yeah, all right. Well, thanks for being here today. I wish it was a better occasion, but you're definitely somebody who knows a lot about the context here, so I appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks a lot. I enjoyed it.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being here today and talking with us about the context behind January 6th. I wanted to remind everybody that Theory of Change is part of the flux.community media network. So please check that out. It's flux.community. And we can definitely use your help with getting more shows out there for everybody and getting more articles, because these are stories that are complicated and they're hard for the mainstream media to even understand, much less cover correctly. So please visit us at patreon.com/discoverflux. And I appreciate everybody who is supporting us already right now. That's much appreciated. Definitely, we couldn't do it without you, and we got to keep expanding here and telling the full story in American politics of right-wing extremism. We're going to be back next week with another good program at Thursday at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And I will see you next time. Bye.